A girl was crying at her parents' grave when a stranger approached her and told her something she couldn't believe. Cemetery, August 1894. The morning mist softly enveloped the ancient gravestones of the cemetery. The first rays of sunlight pierced through the moist air, playing on the marble slabs and creating an illusion of frozen time. This was a place where every whisper of the wind and every rustle of leaves transported one to the past, to those times when stories were just beginning. Under the shadow of mighty oaks standing tall like guardians of time, the cemetery looked more like a park where sorrow and peace found their mutual reflection. Here, surrounded by the walls of an ancient church, many prominent figures had found their final resting place. Marble and granite tombstones, adorned with symbols of faith and family crests, added a special status to this place. Majestic family mausoleums towered among more modest graves, and the summer light and carefully selected flowers left by relatives of the deceased added picturesque beauty and a sense of life to this abode of eternity. 9-year-old Elizabeth Roosevelt walked slowly along a narrow path between rows of ancient tombs, her small, childish steps barely audible on the gravel. She was dressed in a simple black dress that seemed too grown up for her young age. Her face expressed deep sorrow, her eyes, hidden in the shadows cast by her wide-brimmed hat, filled with tears from time to time. Elizabeth stopped by 2 graves, which stood out for their newness among the old tombstones. One was still quite fresh, the earth on it had not yet had time to be covered with grass. The names of her parents, Elliot and Mary Roosevelt, were engraved on the stone slabs. Elliot had passed away only a week ago, and Mary had died 2 years earlier, but time had not yet been able to heal the wound she had left in her daughter's soul. Standing at the final resting place of her loved ones, little Ellie recalled her mother, her gentle hands, kind look, and smile. At the same time, these memories were mixed with her pale face, white lips, nervous fits, and the terrible cough that echoed through every corner of their home. She remembered all of her mother's states in her last days, the days when she was dying from that terrible illness. Mary Roosevelt, née Hall, was a prominent figure in American society at the turn of the 20th century. Born in 1863 to wealthy parents, she was immersed in the world of high society from a young age, where luxury and abundance were commonplace. Her father, William Hall, was a successful businessman, and her mother, Dorothy Livingston, came from one of the old American families. This ensured that Mary not only had a prosperous youth, but also access to the best education of her time. Mary grew into a beautiful and educated woman, with refined taste and exquisite manners. She was known for her gentle and kind nature, which made her the darling of her family and friends. Her communication skills and involvement in charity work made her popular in high society. Her marriage to Elliot Roosevelt added a new chapter to her life. Their wedding was truly fairy tale-like, but the life that followed was full of trials. Mary lost her health early, and each subsequent year of her life was overshadowed by illness. Elizabeth remembered her mother, still beautiful but already exhausted, spending days in the garden on a bench covered with soft pillows. She would read books or simply watch her daughter play, always with a smile, even when each breath caused her pain. Her death 2 years ago from diphtheria was slow and agonizing. The young woman was only 29 years old. She passed away in her home. This tragedy took not only her life, but also the life of her little son, Elliot Jr., who died just a few days before her, also from diphtheria. It was an extremely difficult time for the Roosevelt family. In those days, diphtheria was one of the most dangerous diseases, especially for children. The illness started with seemingly harmless symptoms, such as a slight sore throat and fever, but it quickly progressed. Mary and her son, Elliot Jr., developed difficulty breathing due to the growing pseudomembranous coating in their throats, which hindered normal breathing and swallowing. Mary's condition worsened every day, and she suffered from acute throat inflammation, severe pain, and difficulty breathing. At a time when antibiotics had not yet been invented, treatment was limited and often ineffective. Doctors and family did everything they could to ease her suffering, but the disease was too aggressive. The death of Mary and Elliot Jr. left a deep wound in the hearts of their family. Elliot Roosevelt, her husband, was devastated by the loss. He felt guilt for not being able to protect his family from this terrible disease. This tragedy also significantly impacted their other children, including Elizabeth, who always remembered her mother as a loving and caring woman. This was the first and perhaps the greatest loss in Ellie's life, a pain that forced her to grow up too soon. The girl's father, Elliott Roosevelt, was the younger brother of the future President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He belonged to a famous family. Elliott received a good education and initially followed the family tradition of public service. He was known for his charm and charisma, which made him popular in high society. However, unlike his brother Franklin, his life was marred by personal tragedies and scandals. Despite his social standing, Elliott struggled with alcoholism, which severely affected his career and personal life. His addiction led to serious family problems and even legal issues. He loved his children and adored his wife Mary to madness. Her death completely threw him off balance. He found solace from the loss of his wife in the bottle, which marked the beginning of his end. Elizabeth remembered nights when, from behind the closed door of his study, she could hear the sounds of falling objects and his dull, desperate, and unnatural laughter. Empty champagne and brandy bottles, his drinks of choice in a desperate attempt to forget, were scattered around the house. And then, just 2 years after her mother's death, she lost him too, in such a terrible manner and under such awful circumstances. Now she was left all alone, an orphan in this dreadful and cruel world. The last months of her father's life were extremely difficult for the little girl. Elliott increasingly withdrew into himself, distancing himself from the daughter he once loved dearly. When he died, Elizabeth felt not only grief but also a sense of relief that his suffering had finally ended. His end was highly tragic and came as a complete shock to all family members. Unable to cope with depression and alcohol addiction, Elliott took a desperate step. One night, in complete despair, he jumped out of the window of his study. Remarkably, despite the significant height, the fall was not fatal. He survived. But the next day, he suffered a severe seizure, leading to heart failure. That same evening, the day after his failed suicide attempt, he passed away at home, surrounded by close family and servants. Now, fear and loneliness completely gripped Elizabeth's soul. She knew she would soon move to her grandmother's house, where a new chapter of her life would begin. But her heart remained here, among the quiet voices of the past, echoing in every rustle of leaves and every gust of wind at the cemetery. What lay ahead for her? How would the city welcome her? Could her grandmother replace her mother? And how close could their relationship become? Ellie did not know the answers to these questions. Ahead, she saw only emptiness and uncertainty, while behind her were only pain and suffering. At her parents' graves, she recalled one of the hardest days of her life when, after her mother's death, she was left alone in her now empty room for the first time. According to an old tradition, all the mirrors in the house where a person had recently died were covered with sheets. According to belief, this was done so that the soul of the recently deceased, upon seeing its reflection, would not be frightened and could peacefully depart to the other world. This symbolized a temporary break between the worlds of the living and the dead, between the past and the future. The mirror in Elizabeth's room was also shrouded in darkness. Slowly and hesitantly, she moved aside a corner of the sheet, revealing the reflective surface. In the reflection, she saw a girl with an ordinary, unremarkable appearance, someone she could never consider beautiful. She looked nothing like her magnificent mother, with her unique grace, posture, and enchanting face that drew the eyes of passers-by, and this fact depressed her even more. Elizabeth peered into her own eyes, large, but as she thought, too dull, lacking the spark that makes a gaze lively and magnetically attractive. Her hair, dull and unruly, never lay as she wanted, always seeming too ordinary to her. Why can't I look like other girls? Why do I have to be so plain? She asked herself sorrowfully. At that moment, she felt like the ugly duckling that would never turn into a swan. Just then, there was a soft knock at the door. Her grandmother, Dorothy Livingston Ludlow Hall, entered the room. Seeing her granddaughter in such a state, she approached Ellie and quietly asked, "What's wrong, dear?" "Grandmother, I'm so tired of feeling ugly." Everything about me is wrong, Ellie managed to say, struggling with her words. Her grandmother took her hands gently and said, "Do you remember how your mother used to call you Babulio when you were little? She saw something special in you. To her, you were like a character from an old book, full of wisdom and beauty. Your mother always said you seemed to belong to another era, and that made you special." Ellie listened and, despite her tears, smiled. "But grandmother, why can't I see that? Why can't I see myself through my mother's eyes?" "Because you're looking through the lens of your fears," her grandmother replied softly. "Each of us is unique, and that's what makes us beautiful. You don't need to look like everyone else, Ellie. You just need to be yourself." And now, standing at her parents' grave, her old fears overwhelmed her once again. She still didn't know what lay ahead, who she would become when she grew up. Maybe she would join a convent or, like her mother, die from some terrible disease, or perhaps end her life, finishing what her father couldn't. The thought of getting married or having children never even crossed little Ellie's mind. Who would want such an old-fashioned, ugly duckling, so lonely and with such a complicated fate? Engulfed in these dreadful thoughts, she didn't notice a completely unfamiliar man approaching her parents' grave. Stopping nearby, he glanced grimly at the headstones and read the names and dates of the deceased. Understanding the situation, he decided to speak with the girl. The man's name was Carl Brownie. He was a tall, middle-aged man with large blue eyes and chestnut hair. He had come to visit the grave of his wife and daughter, who had died together in a car accident just a few months ago. Now he too was left utterly alone in this unjust world. His daughter had been only 10 years old at the time of her death, and Ellie, in her little black dress, reminded him of his own little girl. When the tragedy happened, he had been at work. No, he wasn't a soldier, quite the opposite. 2 years ago, Carl had lost his job after the factory where he had worked for many years shut down. After months of unsuccessful attempts to find a new job and facing a severe lack of funds, he and his family found themselves on the brink of absolute poverty. During these dark times, he learned about a movement led by businessman Jacob Coxey. Coxey argued that the government should actively help its citizens suffering from the crisis. He proposed a plan for federal investment in infrastructure, including the construction of roads and other public works, which could create new jobs and stimulate the economy by introducing additional paper money into circulation. Inspired by this idea and seeing no other alternatives, Carl joined the movement. This group, known as Coxey's Army, was more than just a protest march. It was a movement of people filled with both desperation and hope, determined to go all the way to make their demands heard by the authorities. The group attracted more supporters as they passed through various towns and villages, explaining their goals and recruiting new members to their cause. Though often seen as dreamers, their resolve resonated with many who faced the same hardships. Carl recalled that once, when Coxey's Army entered a small town in the west, he met John Ellery, the owner of a local carpentry shop on the verge of closing due to the economic downturn. "You know, I've worked my whole life to make my business mean something, but now I have to choose between paying off loans and feeding my family," John said bitterly. Carl listened, nodding his head, his own experiences after losing his job making him better understand this man. "We're here to show that together we can change this situation. Our movement is the voice of all of us, and we can make it heard," Carl said convincingly. This meeting turned out to be pivotal for many of the town's residents. That evening, when Carl spoke again at a gathering, a young teacher named Louise approached him. "My father lost his job at the factory, and now I'm the only one providing for our family. Your words gave me hope that we're not alone in this struggle," she admitted. Carl supported her, sharing his own losses and emphasizing the importance of maintaining faith and unity among people facing similar hardships. As Coxey's Army progressed, the number of its supporters grew. People from all walks of life joined them, inspired by their determination and ideas. These meetings and conversations became for Carl not only a means to share his story but also a way for personal growth. He saw how his words and actions influenced people, inspired them to change, and gave them the strength to fight. One day, approaching another town, Carl felt that their mission truly mattered. We are not just a group of rebels, we are a symbol of faith in a better future. Each of us is part of a significant change, and every voice matters, Carl told his new friends and fellow movement members. Thus, despite numerous difficulties and obstacles, Carl Brownie and his comrades in Coxey's army continued their journey, believing that their efforts would not be in vain and that their voices would be heard. However, upon arriving in the next town, they faced an unpleasant encounter. Many were arrested, including Coxey. Yet their actions drew public and media attention to serious issues of economic injustice and highlighted the need for government intervention in the economy. For Carl, participating in this march became a pivotal moment in his life. He realized the importance of active involvement in society and understood that even in extreme need, everyone could fight for their rights and dignity. This experience left an indelible mark on his heart, reminding him of the importance of every voice in the struggle for a better life. But ultimately, instead of the new job and privileges they sought, he received only pain, loss, and the death of the only people dear to him. Now he, too, did not know why to continue living, what meaning there was in this fleeting existence in a world so unjust that it first plunged him into complete poverty, depriving him of the ability even to feed his own family, and then took away the people he loved most. Why them, not me, he had been asking himself for months, unable to find an answer. You're not God, you're a devil with horns. You are the devil incarnate, allowing yourself to mock mortals like this, he blasphemed, downing another shot of the cheapest whiskey. It was a cry from the soul, a reflection of his inner struggle and suffering. Each sip of alcohol seemed like an attempt to forget, an attempt to escape the cruel reality he found himself in. But the alcohol brought no relief, only plunging him deeper into the abyss of despair. Carl felt his heart grow heavier with each passing day. He saw no point in continuing when everything he cherished had been ripped from his life so brutally and unexpectedly. Life without his loved ones seemed unbearable, and each new day was just a reminder of the losses he had endured. Today was just like the days before. It hung in the air like a heavy gray curtain, ready to fall at any moment. For Carl, this day was meant to be the last in his trial-filled life. The pages of his existence, written with grief, seemed intolerable, and he had decided to put an end to it. That is why he came to the cemetery this morning, to see his loved ones one last time. His wife and daughter, who died in that terrible accident, had left him alone in this cold, heartless world. Carl whispered his final words of farewell in front of the neatly kept graves, damp with morning dew. Every word he spoke was filled with love and despair, vibrating in the air like a last breath. After saying his goodbyes, he slowly turned to leave the cemetery. His steps were heavy and uncertain, for his next stop was to be the bridge where he planned to end his suffering. As he walked down the narrow path, his gaze fell upon a small figure standing by one of the graves. For a moment, Carl's heart froze in his chest. The girl seemed almost ghostly in the morning light. He thought it might be his own daughter, returned to him to say something important. He started toward her, gripped by a mixture of hope and pain, staggering as if in a half-dream. However, the closer he got, the faster his illusions faded. This was not his daughter, it was another little girl, whose sorrow in her eyes seemed as deep as his own. When Carl got closer, he saw that the names on the gravestone were completely different. The girl's face was shadowed with profound loss, and at that moment he realized that her pain was probably even greater than his. She stood alone, fragile and defenseless, and Carl understood that despite his age and life experience, this child had endured a loss that was just as devastating as his own. His parents had passed away when he was already an adult, and though it was hard, he could prepare for the inevitable. But this little girl had to face the monstrous reality of loss far too early, before she was emotionally or morally ready. At that moment, something changed in Carl. "Excuse me for disturbing you," he said, his voice raspy as if he hadn't spoken in a long time. "My name is Carl Brownie. I recently buried my daughter and wife here. Today, I came to visit their grave." Ellie looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise and sadness. Carl continued gently, "I couldn't help but notice you here, and I thought maybe we could talk." Sometimes sharing our grief helps us carry it a little better. Upon hearing the words of the stranger, Ellie recoiled and returned to reality with suspicion as she looked at the unfamiliar man. Her heart raced faster as she gazed into his face, searching his eyes for recognition or at least fleeting understanding. The stranger took a hesitant step forward, as if each movement required effort. He paused a few steps away from Ellie, staring at her so intently that she felt as though he could see right through her soul. His words sounded peculiar but sincere. Ellie couldn't look away from his eyes, which seemed strangely familiar, as if they were part of her own forgotten or repressed past. I often come here, to my family's grave. Today, I saw you from afar, and something told me we should talk, continued Carl, not breaking his gaze from Ellie. For a moment, Ellie felt her own grief begin to slightly recede. And what is your name? The man asked again. I understand your parents rest here. If you'd like, we can talk about it. I'm Elizabeth, the girl said. Yes, you're right. My father passed away a few days ago, and it's been 2 years since my mom died. And now you don't know what to do next and what awaits you. I don't know either, and probably no one does, Carl said sadly. I was hoping to drown myself in drink and end it all. Yesterday, I stumbled upon a job, enough for a bottle of whiskey. Silence briefly enveloped them, interrupted only by the rustling of leaves gently caressed by the wind, as if trying to soothe their broken hearts. Suddenly, Elizabeth realized that before her was not just a stranger, but someone who perhaps understood better than most what she was going through. My father also tried to end his life, but it didn't work out. Elizabeth said reproachfully. How so? Carl exclaimed. The rope didn't hold? And why then is he there and not here? He asked, pointing to the grave. No, he drank himself and jumped out of the window, but he survived. And the next day he had a seizure and died of a heart attack, Elizabeth answered detachedly, as if it were self-evident. Wow, that's something, isn't it? Carl said, his surprise evident. And what now? Foster care? Or some awful aunt decided to take you in? Not an aunt, but my grandmother, my mom's mom, Elizabeth sighed. Now I have to move to some village, and I don't even know what awaits me there. I was born in the city. What am I supposed to do in that backwater? She exclaimed irritably. My friends, my home, everything familiar, it's all here. And there's nothing there but pigs, cows, and horses. I don't want to go there. I've already lost everything I had, and now they're taking away the last bit. It's as if I haven't lived all these years. There was a brief pause. Carl looked into the eyes of this little old lady and couldn't fathom how such young eyes could hold so much pain, bitterness, and fear. But you speak as if you know me. Why? Ellie unexpectedly asked, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and hope for understanding. Carl seemed momentarily bewildered, but then his face lit up with a smile full of warmth. Perhaps because I see in you a part of my lost soul. We all search for connection, Elizabeth. Sometimes it finds us when we least expect it. Elizabeth felt her defensive walls beginning to crumble. This stranger, this Carl, now seemed to her someone who could understand her pain better than anyone else. Tell me about your family, she requested, and Carl nodded. As he began his story, Elizabeth felt her heart filling with the warm light of memories and newfound hope. They stood in the cemetery, surrounded by ghosts of the past, yet suddenly that past didn't seem so dreadful after all. Carl Brown shared that he was a simple man from a small town. He had spent his entire life working at a factory that manufactured automobile parts. His life was not easy, but he was kept afloat by his wife Martha and their daughter Emma. Carl adored his family, and he tried to spend every free moment with them. Despite seeming ordinary, his life was filled with warmth, love, and unexpected events. He met Martha one autumn evening at a local harvest festival. Amidst the bright lights and joyful sounds, he noticed Martha standing at one of the stalls, selling handmade embroideries. Martha was charming, her eyes sparkled with happiness and warmth, and her smile could brighten even the darkest night. Carl immediately felt that this was a special encounter. He approached her to buy one of the embroideries, but in reality, to strike up a conversation. They talked all night long, unaware of how quickly time passed. It turned out they had a lot in common, including a love for music and books. Martha was impressed by his simplicity and honesty. Several months of dating later, Carl decided to propose to Martha. But he wanted it to be special. On the day of their first anniversary since they met, Carl invited Martha for a walk in the local park where they had first encountered each other. He had prepared a place for the proposal in advance. He arranged a picnic under an ancient oak tree adorned with twinkling lights. As the sun set and the sky painted itself in vibrant shades of sunset, Carl got down on one knee and asked Martha to marry him. She tearfully said yes, overwhelmed with happiness. A year after their wedding, Carl and Martha learned they were expecting a child. It was an exciting time for both of them. For 9 months, they prepared for the baby's arrival, setting up the nursery, collecting books, and dreaming of future adventures. When their daughter Emma was born, Carl stayed by Martha's side every step of the way. Emma came into the world early in the morning, and her first cry became the most beautiful sound in their lives. Since then, Carl's days were filled with joy and laughter. He loved coming home from work to see Martha teaching Emma to read or draw. On weekends, they often went on family picnics or walks in the parks, creating memories that would warm their hearts for a lifetime. However, difficult times soon followed. Eventually, the factory where Carl worked announced its closure. This was a devastating blow for him, as he not only lost his source of income but also a part of his identity. After several months of fruitless job searches and growing depression, Carl heard about a movement known as the Coxey's Army. This group consisted of unemployed veterans and civilians who organized marches to demand the government create jobs and provide financial support. Feeling desperate yet hopeful for change, Carl decided to join them. Martha supported his decision, understanding that this step could offer their family a chance at a better future. Before leaving, Carl promised them he would return home with new opportunities. Little did they know, this farewell would mark the final meeting for their entire family. Just a few months after Carl left, marching with his comrades through the city, Martha and Emma went to the nearest town market. Suddenly, on a rain-slick road, their car collided with a truck. Carl learned of the tragedy as the march approached the city square. A family hosting them for the night in the nearest town delivered a letter from the local sheriff. The deaths of his wife and daughter were devastating for Carl. He felt immense guilt for not being with them in their final moments. Immediately after, Carl returned to his small hometown. His once joy-filled home now seemed empty and lifeless. Every corner reminded him of Martha and Emma. Every item in the house held memories of happy days spent together. Struggling to cope with the loss, Carl often wandered through the garden where Martha loved tending flowers and spent hours sitting on the bench where they watched Emma play. These places were filled with memories of his family. And now I don't know what awaits me either. Just 10 minutes ago, I knew, and now I don't, he said quietly, concluding his story. Ellie was deeply moved by this story. She saw the family happiness that had belonged to this simple and ordinary man. She felt the love, pain, and suffering he had endured in recent months, and her own past memories no longer seemed as tragic and unbearable to her. Her father had also deeply loved her mother, and she herself had never doubted it. Ellie remembered the beautiful days when her father was sober, her mother healthy, and they were all happy. Yes, tragedies had occurred in her life and things would never be the same again, but love still existed, and this simple man with his enormous heart was direct proof of that. What did you know awaited you, and what changed? Ellie asked with curiosity. Or is that a secret? No, the man smiled. There's no secret here. Before I met you, a bridge awaited me. You probably know it's a favorite spot for suicides among our townspeople. So, I decided not to be an exception, but now. When I saw you walking down the alley, I was sure you were my daughter. You resemble her so remarkably. Same hair, same hairstyle. And now your story about your father. And now I don't know where to go next. You should go home. Ellis said. Have some hot soup and get some sleep. I'm sure your wife and daughter will visit you in your dreams tonight. Once again, Carl was amazed by the wisdom of this little girl, and he had no choice but to agree with her. Yes, you're right. I'll go home and have some soup. And what will you do tonight? He asked as they parted. I'll go home too, but not to sleep, to pack my bags. Tomorrow morning, I have a long journey to the village, to my new home with my grandmother. Ellis sighed and headed towards the cemetery exit without even saying goodbye. Remember, you saved my life, Ellis. Carl shouted after her. Ellis turned around, and he saw her smile for the first time. You're not the last, Carl, not the last, she said and walked away. Watching her leave, Carl stared after her for a long time. If only he had known how prophetic the words of this little girl would be. I wonder who she'll become when she grows up, he thought then. If at 9 years old she's already so mature and sensible that even a guy like me, who's seen it all, has been talked out of committing suicide. If only Carl had known that before him was none other than Eleanor Roosevelt herself. After moving in with her grandmother, the girl faced challenging times. The old woman loved her granddaughter, but demanded strictness and obedience, which wasn't always easy for the girl. However, it was during these years that she learned to value discipline and responsibility, which would play an important role in her future life. Eleanor attended a private girls' school where, under the influence of the progressive school director, Molly Sylvester, she began to take an interest in social issues and develop her leadership qualities. Her return marked a new stage in her life, where she soon married her distant relative, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. This marriage strengthened her position in society and provided her with a platform to realize her ideas. As First Lady after Franklin's election as president, Eleanor did not confine herself to the traditional role of a housewife. She actively participated in public life, advocated for women's rights, fought for the civil rights of African Americans, and supported the poorest segments of the population. Eleanor also played a crucial role in creating the New Deal program aimed at combating the Great Depression. Like her mother's marriage, hers was not a gift of fate. She experienced the death of a child and her husband's infidelity, after which her whole world was turned upside down. Yet despite this, the mature Eleanor always found the strength to move forward. After her husband's death, Eleanor did not retire from political life. She became a delegate and actively participated in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, becoming one of its authors. Eleanor Roosevelt remained an active public and political figure until her death in 1962, continuing to inspire people with her example of serving society and fighting for human